I really don't think that you would have this kind of extreme polarization without the internet. By that, he didn't mean that America was exceptionally good. He said that it was both exceptionally good and exceptionally bad. If you look at states within the United States, there's different mixtures of this. The areas that were settled by Scandinavians, like Minnesota and many parts of the Midwest, they do manage to take care of people, but there's also a fair amount of innovation.
Olá, o meu nome é José Maria Pimentel e este é o 45 Graus. Este episódio é em inglês e tem um convidado muito especial, Francis Fukuyama. Fukuyama é professor de Ciência Política na Universidade de Stanford, nos Estados Unidos, e é hoje um dos intelectuais públicos mais influentes no espaço público, de resto, nas últimas décadas. Ele tornou-se conhecido com o livro O Fim da História e o Último Homem, publicado logo depois da queda da União Soviética e que se tornou numa das obras mais influentes do século XX. No livro, Fukuyama defendia que a democracia liberal podia ser o modelo final e mais estável de organização política. Uma tese que tem dado muito que falar desde então e que ele próprio veio a revisitar em livros seguintes. Embora ele seja ainda hoje conhecido sobretudo por este livro, a investigação académica de Fukuyama vai muito mais longe. Ele é um autor influente na literatura académica sobre história dos sistemas políticos, democracia, qualidade da governação e é também hoje em dia um pensador ainda muito ativo em debates sobre populismo, tecnologia e a saúde das democracias. Esta conversa proporcionou-se porque conheci Fukuyama numa conferência organizada pelo Jornal de Negócios. Tenho de agradecer, porque esta conversa não se teria realizado de outra forma, à Diana Ramos, a diretora do Jornal de Negócios, que nos apresentou no final da conferência, no passado dia 9 de novembro, em Lisboa, da qual Fukuyama foi o orador principal. Valeu muito a pena, porque nesta conversa percorremos quase todos os grandes desafios atuais das democracias. Falámos sobre o chamado recuo das democracias, o democratic backsliding, que tem acontecido um pouco por todo o mundo, quer com o sucesso de figuras autoritárias, quer em resultado do crescimento do populismo. E falámos também sobre como isto é, em parte, pelo menos, causado pelo facto de o Estado, em muitos países, ter perdido a capacidade de governar, a capacidade de fazer coisas. Falámos também sobre a diversidade que existe hoje dentro do populismo. Uns são caóticos, como Trump, outros autoritários, como Viktor Orban, na Hungria, outros revelam-se mais moderados, como Giorgia Meloni, em Itália, e outros desafiam classificações, como é o caso de Javier Milei, na Argentina. Falámos ainda de um dos temas em que tenho pensado mais, como sabe quem tem ouvido o podcast, o facto de a polarização política atual que se vive em várias democracias não poder ser explicada sem o impacto disruptivo da internet e das redes sociais. Sendo este um dos desafios que Portugal tem enfrentado, perguntei também a Fukuyama sobre como lidar com o desafio da imigração e o que é que podemos aprender com outras democracias. No meio disto tudo, tivemos também tempo para falar sobre diferenças culturais entre os Estados Unidos e a Europa e o papel que podem ter novas ferramentas, desde a inteligência artificial às chamadas assembleias deliberativas, na reconstrução da confiança democrática e na melhoria do funcionamento das democracias. Foi um verdadeiro tour de force esta conversa com Francis Fukuyama. Espero que gostem e até ao próximo episódio.
Se gosta de ouvir podcasts, conheça a oferta que o Expresso tem para si. Da política à economia, ciência e cultura, passando pelo desporto. Entrevistas marcantes, análises e perspectivas que fazem a diferença. Ouça em expresso.pt e nas principais plataformas de podcast. Expresso. Liberdade para pensar.
Professor Fukuyama, thank you for being on 45 Graus. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with heavy stuff, as it were. So you are perhaps less well known to the general audience for your influential work on governance and political institutions, and you've argued that the three pillars of political order are, if I'm not stating this wrong, state capacity, rule of law, and accountability. So
right.
State capacity is the ability of the state to do stuff, in the sense to have the resources to do it.
Yes.
Rule of law is to what extent it is impartial in doing so absence of corruption and so on. And accountability is democracy. Now, if we look at the state of democracies in the world, we see a lower trust, we see democratic backsliding, we see the rise of populists. From these three pillars, which one of them do you see as the biggest culprit for this trend in recent decades?
I don't know that you can identify a single culprit because they interact at many levels. So, for example, I think that the failure of states to actually deliver on goods for their citizens, like infrastructure, like housing, like security, which is a big issue, for example, in Latin America. That has led to a lot of voter discontent that then gets reflected in elections that bring populists to power, and many of those populists claim to be strong men that can solve some of these problems by breaking through all of the constraints that are imposed by having a real rule of law. And I think that's one of the unhealthy dynamics that's going on right now.
Why do you think that's happening? So why did suddenly states fail to deliver? Or started failing to deliver?
It depends on what part of the world you're talking about. So in many developing countries, you never had a modern state to begin with. And I think this was one of the big failures in a lot of the theoretical literature on development, that it was all done by economists who didn't understand the importance of politics. If you don't have a capable, impersonal bureaucracy, it's actually very hard to develop economically. I think that actually one of the big reasons that East Asia did as well as it has over the last 50, 60, 70 years is that China and the countries that are in the Chinese cultural orbit all had states well before they dealt with European colonialism or foreign invasion, this sort of thing. That's the essence, I think, of Chinese culture, is to have a state bureaucracy that's based on merit and has a lot of capacity. And so that allowed Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and China itself to become these star developers once they settled, civil wars and foreign intervention, this sort of thing.
They had a state before.
They had a state. Yeah. They had a long-standing state that was actually much older than any state in Europe.
Yeah, and there's a sort of an inconvenient truth in political history, in that in many countries, the state was built before democracy, as it were. So, yeah.
No, absolutely. I think that, in fact, it has to be built before democracy because you need basic political order. Yeah. I mean, you have to have security. If you have a society that's ravaged by a lot of militias or gangs or, whatever, where there's no central legitimate source of authority, you're never going to develop, and you're certainly not going to have a democracy.
Yeah, but the implications of what you're arguing is that if you are in a situation in which you have sort of a democracy but no functional state, the only way to solve it is to sort of go back to a dictatorship, solve the state, and then reinstate the democracy.
Well,
which might be true. I wanted to speak freely.
No,
but it's an unpopular opinion.
I guess there's a couple things to say. You can both build a state and build democracy simultaneously, so they're not necessarily at odds. I would say, however, historically, the state-building part has come before democratization. In Europe, most countries weren't democratic until the 20th century. It took, a long time, but they actually had developed modern states. And again, one unfortunate truth is that most of them developed modern states under autocratic conditions, like the famous Prussian bureaucracy, or, the French bureaucracy that was built, under the old regime, but then by Napoleon. And if they didn't have the necessity of fighting wars, they never would have developed centralized taxation, capable bureaucrats, and the like.
So going back to the first point, let's focus just on what is already a very broad umbrella: Europe, North America, and Latin America. Are these governments performing worse than they were 20 or 30 years ago, or are people suddenly more demanding, or is it more visible? So at the structural level, what's happening? Because 20 or 30 years ago, we didn't have this backlash, and suddenly we have it. Is it that the states got worse?
Well, I think you have to disaggregate because you have different remedies for different countries. I think the state in the United States has definitely gotten worse. If you think about just building things, the United States, beginning in the Progressive era at the end of the 19th century, and then through the Depression, they built things like the Golden Gate Bridge and the Tennessee Valley Authority. They mobilized for the Second World War very effectively. They won that war. And then they promised to put a man on the moon in 10 years, and they did that. And I don't think any of those things could happen under current circumstances, because I think the American state, in a sense, has ossified. It's become too rigid. There are too many conditions and rules that are placed on it that prevent it from acting effectively. In other areas in the developing world, you started out with much weaker states and where you really needed to build state capacity. I think that That was partly successful. So, for example, the debt crisis in Latin America was really caused by incompetent central banks, finance ministries, and so forth. And so there's a big effort after the debt crisis to build the capacity in those areas. And today, with the exception of Venezuela and a couple of other countries, inflation has not been a big problem. You're not going to get into the kind of crisis that you had in the 1970s and 80s. But it's still not an area in which you have competent kind of European or East Asian bureaucracies that are full of technocrats, highly skilled professionals. You still have a lot of patronage and clientelism where, people are appointed because they're political allies of whoever is the president or prime minister, not because they have the skills and the background to actually do things competently.
Focusing on the US, which you know best, of course, how has the quality of state bureaucracy decreased? I don't know if you agree with this conceptualization, but we can sort of look at politics and look at democracy as the input side and governance as the output side, right? So the input side is to what extent our wishes as citizens reflected in the government's policies, and the output side is to what extent are those policies effective, right? So the input side is very broken. So it's much more polarized than it was in the past, than it was in the 60s. But on the output side, I've always been curious about that, because there's a big debate in the US about to what extent, the whole thing about the deep state and so on. So is the public bureaucracy really worse than it was in the golden years of the 1960s? And if so, why? I mean, what happened? Suddenly because it's not those countries in that where they started just hiring people for political reasons, I think, or maybe it is.
No, I think that there's a clear pattern to the deterioration of the American state, which just has to do with the accumulation of too many rules. Americans never trusted the government. This is one of the deep characteristics that distinguishes the United States from most European countries. And because of this distrust, Congress has always been very eager to place controls, to hold hearings, to write rules, very detailed rules for how the American bureaucracy is supposed to operate. And so you have a procurement scandal in which there's some corruption. And so Congress writes all these detailed rules about how you can procure office furniture in the future to make sure that there's not a trace of corruption, in that transaction. And these things accumulate. The other thing is that the progressive wing that had built the American state during the New Deal in the 1930s up through the 1960s turned against the state in a certain sense, because they began to feel that the state had been captured by big corporations, by, various malign forces in American society. And actually the state, instead of becoming an instrument of progress, had become the enemy of progress. This corresponded with the rise of the environmental movement, with the rise of civil rights, and lo and behold, it turned out the federal government, when it did things, hurt the environment. They sprayed DDT, on fields in the Midwest and poisoned people. It turned out that, the state was not hiring African Americans and women. And so you create this, in a way, a whole progressive, several generations of young people that think that the state is actually the problem, that it's no longer capable of doing things that promote human welfare and happiness, but it really is harming that, and therefore you've got to constrain the state. And there's a perfect meeting of minds between the left and the right, because the right never liked the state in the first place. Yes. They believe that they're making all sorts of decisions, that are left-wing and, out of touch with the American people. And people on the left think that the state is too captured by, capitalist forces and various malign, and together, I think they lead to a bureaucracy that is hugely burdened by too many rules.
To what extent do you buy Robert Putnam's thesis which actually goes in a sense the other way, so it goes to the basis of the whole process, and what he argues is that social capital has been decreasing in the US, so interpersonal trust, to what extent people are able to build associations, to build, it can be something like the next door sports club or a political party or a political movement. And he argues, as you know, he argues that has been going down substantially in the last decades, and that's sort of the ultimate cause of this all. Do you agree with that?
Well, I was involved in that debate over his Bowling Alone book at the time. And I think there's some big problems with the argument. I actually don't think that American social capital, if it's simply the ability of Americans to work together in voluntary organizations, I don't think that's changed. The Americans are still really good at it. The problem is different, which is that there isn't what Putnam called bridging social capital that actually allows people with differing points of view to work together. American civil society today is highly organized. Every single interest has a professionalized association to defend those interests. Every disease has an advocacy organization. Every, Indian tribe or ethnic minority is organized, to represent its interests. But what you don't have is I think a common sense of Americanness, and then you overlay the polarization that's taken place in American politics on top of that, and it turns out that these highly organized groups hate each other. And so every time...
they're able to organize, but within themselves, not...
Within themselves, yeah. And I think what you're lacking is a kind of sense of any kind of common purpose that would allow these highly polarized groups to say, well, we're all part of the same society, we need to get things done, therefore we need to compromise our positions and work with people that we disagree with. And that's the thing that I think has changed.
When you travel through Europe on that level, what are the main differences you find?
Well, Europe never had this kind of deep distrust of the state that America did. I think that's just a feature of American political culture that comes from America's history as a revolt against the English monarchy and parliament.
And you built the state from bottom up in the US, right?
But it was much later. The big reform movements in Germany and France and Britain all took place, much earlier than in the United States. It only really happened in the US in the late 19th century and was never fully completed. And I think that Europeans and Asians just have a different attitude. Many of them think, well, the state is there to protect us. It protects us from corporations, from market forces, from terrorists, from all sorts of malign actors that are going to harm, our collective well-being. And Americans tend to think that the state is the big threat to their well-being because...
They trust more the other people.
Yeah, right. That's right. So for example, in Europe, there's a deep distrust of corporations like these big tech companies that are running, the internet platforms. In the United States, it's the other way around, that people actually like the private sector and they distrust government regulation. And so that's why there's more regulation in Europe than there is in the US.
What I feel, correct me if you disagree with this, but what I feel is that in both geographies or in both places, there's mistrust of both the government and corporations. Just the balance between those mistrusts is different, right? Because in the US, you also have mistrust of the corporations.
Definitely.
You're just lower than the mistrust you have on government. And here's the same thing. If you go on the street and ask people about government, they'll tell you the worst things.
Yeah.
But then they will want the government still to regulate those corporations because ultimately they think it's a better solution.
Well, it also differs from one European country to another. So if you go to Northern Europe, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Britain to some extent, they've got a much older tradition of, pretty high quality government. Whereas if you go to Southern Europe, Italy, Greece, so forth, for various complicated historical reasons, the state was never as dominant, and the quality of the state was always, in terms of levels of corruption and patronage, was always much higher in Southern Europe than it was in Northern Europe. And so the performance of the state, has also varied. I was a visiting professor in a Danish university, and as an American, it was really quite jarring to hear Danes say, well, I don't mind paying high taxes. And this was in the days when their tax rate was much, much higher than the American tax rate. Because they said, I get a lot back, I get education, I get health care, I get a pension, and the state does this very competently. You'd never hear an American say anything remotely like that.
But Denmark is like Denmark and Sweden, I think, are the pinnacle of state effectiveness.
That's right.
If you go to other countries, it's still a bit different. And there, since we are talking about culture, there's I can't resist asking you this. While on other levels, there's a big heterogeneity among European countries, there's one dimension on which you can clearly make a comparison between Europe and the US almost as a whole. And you can see this in the World's Value Survey dataset, which is to what extent do you believe your position in life is a result of your own actions or either trust or your social background or something like that. And in Europe, most people believe that it's the latter.
Yes.
So either luck or your social background. Whereas in the US, people believe it's the result of their own effort. Why do I think this is interesting? I think this has all sort of implications on the political level too, right?
Yeah, definitely. No, this is a long-standing debate about why no socialism in the United States.
Yeah.
Right, every European country has had a socialist party that wanted the state to take care of people. And I think the fundamental explanation for this still remains the case. It's that in Europe you had feudalism in which you had a protective state that, had a relationship with people. In the United States, you start out as a settler colony where you have individuals that basically have to look out for themselves, and they see the state as a threat to that kind of individualistic independence. Yeah. And I think that explains a lot of the difference between Europe and the United States. In America, we've had this myth that every individual is responsible for their situation in life. And if you're poor, it's your damn fault, because you didn't work hard enough. Yeah. You had the opportunity and you...
That's a reverse side of the coin, right?
Yeah. Whereas in Europe, I think if you're poor, you'll say, well, I was born into a working class family, I wasn't given opportunities, and that's why I'm poor.
Yeah. And there's a paradox there, which is, I'm not sure you agree with it. I think you agree with this. I think Europeans are right on this one, right? Mm-hmm. Mostly our what we end up doing is more an effect of our background than of our intrinsic value. But on the other hand, if we believe that our outcome in life is the effect of our intrinsic value, we'll work much harder, and the country as a whole will be better. So that it's a sort of a paradox here where maybe the truth is not the most conducive to collective well-being, as it were. Collective, because then you have the poor, for which this might be completely disastrous, right? As you were saying.
So one of my great mentors was Seymour Martin Lipset, a great sociologist and political scientist. And his last book was called American Exceptionalism. By that, he didn't mean that America was exceptionally good. He said that it was both exceptionally good and exceptionally bad, and the two things were related to each other. And so, for example, this American individualism means that we don't have a strong welfare state, we don't believe in taking care of less fortunate Americans, but we also have a higher level of entrepreneurship, of risk-taking, of much more vigorous market culture, because we believe that individuals, should have the opportunity to enrich themselves and build new things. So it's both good and bad. It's also the lack of respect for authority is what makes the United States have a much higher crime rate than most European countries. On the other hand, that willingness to break rules is what led to Apple computers and, all these innovative companies that didn't simply want to go along in the same path that, everybody else was following. So that's why it's a double-edged sword. It has a good side and a bad side.
And are there American states on which this square has sort of been circled? So in a sense on which you get the best of both worlds, of individualism and stability, as it were? Well, a far-fetched question. You've never thought of this.
This is an interesting question. I think that culture is very important, and there's a lot of variation within the United States. If you look at states within the United States, there's different mixtures of this. The areas that were settled by Scandinavians, like Minnesota and many parts of the Midwest, actually get that balance pretty well. They do manage to take care of people, but there's also a fair amount of innovation. Other states, look much worse. So if you go into the Deep South, you had this, first of all, you had the legacy of slavery. You have a very hierarchical society in which, people at the bottom are not given, many opportunities. And so there's a huge, variation within the United States and in the way that balance is struck.
Yeah. Let's go back to the topic we left a while ago, populism, and the whole democratic backsliding. There's paradox on which there has been a lot of discussion, and I'm sure you've thought of it, which is that on the one hand we depart from the premise that indeed the state is performing worse, so there are reasons for people to complain, but then the responses by the populists and the way they behave once they are in power are even worse. So their responses are simple, and whenever they are in power, or maybe not whenever, but most times when they achieve power, they tend to be not effective at all. But people still voting for populist politicians around the world. So which creates a paradox here, because if, again, going back to the premise, if people are unhappy about government, And if there's another party which gets power and does even worse, then people should sack that politician and vote someone else in. So there's a paradox here. What's your view?
That's correct. I think that you see this going on in the United States where people are unhappy with the government, they don't trust it. And many Americans are just ignorant about what the government does, and they think that, it consists of a bunch of bureaucrats sitting around in front of their computers playing computer games and, basically having a nice vacation at taxpayers' expense. And so they are perfectly willing to do like Elon Musk did and simply fire people arbitrarily. And they don't really understand that the government actually does important things. It keeps their social security checks coming. It makes sure that airplanes aren't colliding with each other in airports. It makes sure that the streets are paved, at all sorts of levels. And I think it's a deep misunderstanding about the importance of government in people's lives. And you're right that when populist politicians actually do come to power, well, they can go in one of two ways. They can actually wake up to the fact that if you don't get the garbage collected, you're not going to win the next election and actually start improving government, or they fail to perform and then, they're out. Now, what's an interesting case is something like Hungary, where I think there has been a deterioration under a populist, pretty authoritarian party and leader. There, I think there's a great irony that they've been bailed out by the EU itself, because something like 4% of Hungarian GDP is due to the subsidies that they get from the EU. And so in that particular case, the populace doesn't have to bear the consequences of bad government.
Yeah. Although, to be fair, that happens to the populists and also to other governments with bad policies in other countries.
That's true.
And it's not only the case of Hungary. Although there's an interesting aspect of populism is that if we had this conversation, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, the picture would be mostly bleak and the one I presented before. But nowadays we have some interesting cases which have gone a bit differently. And you mentioned them in the conference this morning. So you have Italy with Giorgia Meloni, where she seemed to have diverted from the typical populist path. And then you have some wild cards, like in Argentina, like Milei, who is a populist, but is also kind of a ultra-libertarian. So it's not clear what he's doing. And in terms of policies, some of them are quite radical, but others are, of course, ideological, but what many economists would recommend. So the picture is more diverse now than it was a few years ago, right?
No, I think that's right. I mean, Giorgia Meloni actually turned out, there's certain core issues like immigration that she still cares very much about, and her policies diverge from the liberal norm, much more, wanting to close Italy's borders. But she's a supporter of Ukraine. She's a supporter of NATO. She's actually been reasonably good for an Italian politician in managing the macroeconomy in Italy. So she's definitely a different sort. Milei is a really complicated case. I think you have to understand the context of Argentina, where you've had successive governments that have just spent way too much money. There's a joke that's told among development economists. There are 4 types of countries in the world. There are rich countries, there are poor countries, there's Japan, and there's Argentina. So Japan can't get inflation going even if they try really hard. And Argentina can't prevent inflation from happening, no matter what government is in power. And Milei is really the first, leader that has actually tried a strong enough medicine to get that under control, in terms of his kind of libertarian policies. But, the Argentine state was out of control. They had too many civil servants. They really needed to reduce the size of the state. And the kind of medicine that Elon Musk was trying to impose on the United States actually would have been more appropriate in Argentina because they did have a very big, inefficient bureaucracy. But he's also Milei has personally adopted a lot of the anti-elite rhetoric of Trump and these other populists.
And even the conservative part. So in the beginning was a kind of anarcho-capitalist, so ultra-libertarian, but he's also anti-abortion,
that's right.
So it's not, for me, it's not easy to figure out at all. So where he's just another populist, or whether he's sort of a Margaret Thatcher, if you will.
Well, he's not a populist in the sense of doing things that are popular and easy but bad in the long run. He's actually made...
he's actually going the other way around, in a sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's put Argentina through a really hard period, making, I think, the justified argument that if we don't do this, we're just going to be in the same inflationary spiral that we've been in for the last 100 years. So in that sense, he's been an anti-populist and doing unpopular things.
Yeah, it has the populist rhetoric, but not the populist policies. Right. Yeah.
Right.
But it's difficult for me to figure him out. You mentioned immigration, and that's of course a big topic everywhere, but especially in Europe. And it wasn't so some years ago, but nowadays it's a very big topic here in Portugal because we've had a big influx of immigrants, and that's created all sort of tensions and backlash, which are to some extent normal, but also as elsewhere fueled up by populist rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any advice there? So we know that whenever there's fast immigration, there's some reaction from the electorate, and we also know that populist leaders tend to fly that to surf that wave. Based on other countries, is there something we can learn in terms of dealing with this issue in an effective way?
Well, I think that the thing that people really object to is not immigration per se, but uncontrolled immigration. If you look at Australia and Canada, they actually have higher percentages of foreign-born people than the United States or many European countries, but they only let in people that they deliberately want to let in. They have skill requirements and this sort of thing. The problem in the United States, if you look at the poll data, is people aren't, except for this very hardcore of nativist people, most Americans, they're descended from immigrants and they appreciate the role that immigrants play. What they didn't like was that people were just coming in without anybody even knowing that they were in the country. There's no way of controlling the numbers. I think that numbers are important because really immigration helps if they can be integrated into the larger society, adopt the language, the norms, the customs of the people that have been living there for longer. And it's harder to do that when the numbers rise to, very large percentages because
it happens very fast.
Yeah. And they'll live in neighborhoods where they only speak their language and they don't, learn the language of everybody else and this sort of thing. And that's what I think really people are worried about. And I think it's a legitimate thing to be concerned over. So I think it's really the control over the process that's really the key.
Yeah. And that point you bring up is a very good one, that most people are not really nativists. And actually this touches another big discussion with which you are surely familiar, which is that while we have seen the rise of right-wing populism over recent decades, especially a decade and a half, at the same time, if we look at people's values around the world, they are becoming more progressive, as it were. I'm not sure this is the right word, but they are becoming more open towards diversity in general, which creates another paradox. So while people are becoming at least the way they respond to surveys, they seem to be becoming more open and progressive. They as a whole are voting for populist leaders, which creates an apparent contradiction here.
Yeah, I don't think it's an apparent contradiction. I really do think it's related to numbers and control, as I was saying, that you can appreciate the contribution that immigrants make, especially in many advanced countries where populations are declining, where you don't have enough labor to run your hotels or, your kitchens or your factories, and you need more people for everybody's benefit. There's no way you're going to fund Social Security in the long run if you don't have enough, younger workers. But if that process, moves too quickly, and if the numbers are too great, and if it doesn't look like those people are being well integrated into the society, that's when I think you get this, very severe backlash. Joe Biden, I think, made a very big mistake in not trying to control, people seeking asylum over the southern border. He could have done that. I think both Obama and Trump actually had much tougher immigration control policies than.
So why do you think he didn't do it?
Well, it's a combination of things. I think he didn't take the issue seriously enough. There is a wing, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party that's very pro-immigration, that they think that really there shouldn't be, constraints and restrictions on numbers. And he, I think, was unfortunately listening to that wing of his own party than, the more centrist people that were more in touch with, I think, ordinary people's opinions.
The problem here is that in hindsight, easy to say where you should have drawn the line. But if we were there, it's a much tougher decision, because what you are balancing out is political stability on the one hand and humanitarian concerns on the other. Because if you don't let people in, these are actual people that you're leaving at the border. So for that decision to make sense, it needs to be something that would have a really bad effect in terms of political stability, which it did. So we now, in hindsight, can say that with some confidence that policies were too lenient, perhaps. But it's and I think this is probably the biggest challenge for mainstream political parties in dealing with these issues. That where do we draw the line? Like this? Do we completely close up borders? This not to mention the economic impact, which of course is another relevant one. But on the humanitarian front, where do you do it? Like, why not close up the country altogether, right? So.
Well, it's very hard. I think that one of the problems is that a lot of the migrants themselves have gamed the system, and they've realized that they have a much better chance of getting into a given country, into a rich country, if they claim persecution. Now, there's plenty of persecution in the world, and there are plenty of people with perfectly legitimate asylum claims. But first of all, you have this problem of numbers. So, a million Syrians came into Europe and particularly into Germany, during the Syrian civil war. And that, I think, would have been destabilizing under any conditions, but those people actually had a real reason to fear for their lives if they stayed in Syria. In the American case, it's more complicated. Most of the migrants that come across the border, some of them are fleeing violence and persecution. A lot of them simply see better economic opportunities. And they discovered that if they claimed that they were refugees rather than simply people seeking to emigrate, that the law would be different and they couldn't be kicked out. They had to be given a judicial process and so forth. And those numbers the law was really designed to deal with the Jews in fleeing Nazi Europe, where you had a few thousand people that were seeking asylum. Today, you literally have millions of people that have claimed asylum, and I think that that's what overwhelmed the system and ultimately sank Joe Biden's election campaign.
It's an instance of Goodhart's law. I don't know if you've heard of this concept, where you define a metric which makes sense in the beginning, but then it's bound to be played with because it creates perverse incentives.
That's right.
Might this be an instance of where we started our conversation, in which you were saying that, and this is something that happens in Europe as well, politicians and lawmakers try so much to constrain the state and the ability of the public bureaucracy to work that they create rules and don't give them autonomy, and then in the end it might both create a sort of a stalemate and paralysis, but also some unintended consequences here, right? Because what you're saying is that there was a law, there were rules that were created, and they are not working. An alternative would be to give that part of the public bureaucracy autonomy to deal with the issue in the way that they see fit within a broad principle, right?
Yeah, quite frankly, that was one of the reasons why people voted for Brexit in Britain. So you had a lot of people claiming asylum status in Britain and a lot of immigration. And it wasn't actually British law, it was European human rights law, the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice that made these very detailed rules about how you can treat immigrants. And in particular, you couldn't send them back to their country of origin, that the moment they physically set foot in the country, they had certain rights. And I think that what
European Union is good at that.
Yeah. When, that's really what caused Brexit to happen, is that, governments said that they were going to control the rate of immigration, but nothing happened. Things weren't changing. And I think people blame that on the fact that they were part of the EU I remember David Cameron at one point, being very angry that he couldn't send, a Syrian that had been accused of murder in Britain couldn't be sent back to Syria because of European law. And so this created this big prejudice against the European Union for having set all these rules that were undermining, national sovereignty. Frankly, I think a lot of that was a specious argument, and there are other reasons why those laws weren't being enforced, but, it certainly fueled this kind of populist backlash.
Yeah. Which was already almost 10 years ago. That's how long this discussion has
the
been.
Other thing that's very curious, and one of the reasons why Nigel Farage's new party is doing so well, what is it, the Reform
UK, I think.
Reform UK, is that under all these conservative governments, after the Brexit vote that promised to control immigration, number of immigrants in Britain has continued to rise, you know. So it's like, it doesn't matter what people vote for, you're still going to have this problem. And I think that's why you still have a populist party that is now threatening the conservatives.
Yeah, but also these populist leaders, they don't need to contend with the difficulties of the decision itself.
No, absolutely not.
Because the reason immigration is rising, I guess, and it's certainly the case for Portugal, is because you need immigrants for the economies. Right? So if you didn't have immigrants, maybe people would be more pleased with that side, but their standard of life would be lower too, right? So that's a decision you need to make. So it's not only that I don't like having immigrants in. You have to balance that out against your standard of living, right?
No, that's right. Well, we're seeing that in the United States now. Trump's campaign to expel immigrants has led to big labor shortages in construction and agriculture, many different sectors, and the economy is paying the price for that.
I think it will be the same here. Yeah. There's one question I've asked many people. I haven't yet got a satisfactory answer. I'm very curious to know your view. If we look at the last 10, 15 years, we've seen on the rise both populism and authoritarianism, sometimes together, like Orban, but not always together. So while we have seen populists like Trump, Bolsonaro, you know, all the political figures in Europe we know about, we've also seen pure authoritarianism growing elsewhere. So we've seen Putin, we've seen Xi. So he's a very different figure from his predecessors, right? So he threw away the term's limitation, he has a much more authoritarian stance, and the same thing for other political leaders. So, but whereas for Orban, we can clearly say that his authoritarianism was bred from populism, is an output of populism. That's not the case of Putin, of Xi, and other authoritarian leaders. Do you see these two phenomena as related at all, or is it just a coincidence that they're happening at the same time? So populism in democracies and authoritarianism in...
Yeah, I think that they have rather different historical origins, that both China and Russia have these very deep authoritarian historical traditions. You know, China was always, since the moment it was unified, 2,500 years ago, been ruled by a centralized authoritarian bureaucracy. And so democracy and ideas of democracy are very late additions. I think that in the 19th century, even back then, Russia was a little bit of a pariah in Europe because it was recognized as such a authoritarian society. It had serfdom, it had all these authoritarian practices. And so there's kind of a continuation of those historical traditions. But ideologically, there's also a difference that, the European populists all pretend that they believe in liberal democracy of some sort. So ideologically, they don't have a complaint about the basic ideas.
Yeah. At least electoral democracy.
Yeah, that's right. But I think with Russia and China, you have kind of overtly authoritarian ideas that are dominating them, and that's why their authoritarianism goes much deeper.
Yeah. So you think it's a coincidence that the two phenomena are happening at the same time? Right?
Well, not entirely. I think there's also a mutual self-interest. Putin has been helping European populists wherever he can,
And then they in turn help him?
Yeah, that's right. So, Robert Fico in Slovakia, he's given Hungary gas and oil because, he wants to keep Orban's regime alive. And conversely, they play an important role for him because they block Europe from supporting Ukraine the way that, it might.
Yeah. And of course, this democratic backslide we've been talking about has been to a large extent caused by what you can call diverse types of diversity. So you have immigration, but you also have other types of, you have identity politics, and you have polarization, and other types of cultural diversity within democracies.
Yeah, but I would say that there's also something in common, which is that a lot of it is really due to technology. I really don't think that you would have this kind of extreme polarization without the internet.
Okay, I wanted to go there, yeah. Because I get this feeling sometimes, I don't know if you do as well, that we tend to focus on economic, social, political causes, while perhaps the main cause of all of this has not to do with any of that, but really, of course those are relevant causes, but the big one might just be that the informational landscape was completely disrupted.
Yeah. I think that really explains the nature and the timing of the rise of populism much better than any of the other. If you look at the world empirically, it's not a bad situation. Most countries are richer than they've ever been. There's a huge amount of individual freedom. You had governments that produced stable societies for many, many years. And so why all of a sudden do you get these people standing up and saying, oh, we face an existential threat that our way of life is going to disappear? And I think that you can only believe that in an information universe where you can have these completely phantasmagorical narratives being told by people. And because it's the internet, anyone can say anything. There's no real regulator of the truth of the things that people say. And I think that's really one of the big drivers of this, both the polarization and the populism.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Actually, I wrote recently an essay which was defending exactly that point. Right? So if we are witnessing that now at this precise moment and not before, and if we are witnessing that almost everywhere among democracies, the cause, it must be something that is happening everywhere at the same time and only now, right? And it creates a big challenge. Although at the same time, in the short run, it's clearly creating a big disruption and facilitating the dissemination of disinformation, creating polarization and whatnot. But at the same time, there's something good which is happening. I don't know if you share this view, because we've both amplified the role of politics, I think, in many people's lives, so people have more access to information, and we've broadened the public space in a way that I think parallels the Gutenberg's revolution, that you have more people participating in the political debate. And this should be good, right?
It should be a good thing. Yeah. And also, I mean, the internet is really useful for teaching people not just about politics, but about all sorts of things. It allows a greater level of association. People can gather together and share ideas in a way that they couldn't before. So the good things, go together with the bad things. One of the things that I think is a good thing that's happened in many countries over the past couple of generations, levels of education have gone up. Levels of critical thinking have gone up. It's not possible to hide bad behavior in a way that it once was. So, we've had in recent years all these, sex scandals in the Catholic Church. Now, is it the case that the Catholic Church is actually becoming more corrupt than it was previously? I really doubt it.
I agree with you.
I really doubt. I mean, if you think about what it was like in the Middle Ages when there was no transparency, it was much, much worse. But because we live in a much more open, information-rich world, we see these abuses much more clearly, and I think that's part of what's driving this feeling that things are getting worse.
I've argued that point. They're not getting worse, but they are much more conspicuous. So there's much more transparency.
Yes.
And the change was so fast that our senses, as it were not prepared for that. Right?
That's right.
I've been thinking a lot about how the new equilibrium, so the future informational mediatic landscape might look like. So will we need to regulate these platforms? Will people's psychology adapt to this new situation? Will we need to create a new media environment, maybe different from the one we had before, based on newspapers, TV channels and whatnot? So have you thought about this? Do you have any view on of course this is a very hard exercise, but...
Well, there are already big differences between Europe and the United States with regard to the internet. So Europe has been much more willing to regulate. You've got GDPR, you've got the Digital Services Act. There's a much stronger attempt to, certify the quality of information. In fact, I think some European countries have gone a little too far in terms of jailing people for tweets that they've posted, that sort of thing. But in the end, it's going to be very difficult to do this because I think that you can do it in Europe because there's still enough of an elite consensus about, the nature of truth and the kinds of political views that are acceptable and not acceptable. In the United States, it's impossible. We're so polarized that you can't have a government that can actually try to regulate the internet that people can agree on, because people, literally don't agree on what's the truth.
Yeah.
You have a substantial a number of Americans that believe that vaccines are more harmful than helpful, and so how are you going to come up with a regulation of vaccine misinformation under those circumstances?
Yeah. And if you do it, it might even backfire electorally, right?
Yeah,
So it's not a good policy. But To be honest, it's true that the European Union has regulated, especially with the Digital Services Act. Maybe I'm being unfair here, but I don't see such a big impact on the way people use social media. Because in the end, it's very difficult, right? It's very difficult to regulate.
That's a separate issue, which where I think you're right. That even if you try to regulate, it's a moving target. The regulators are not going to be able to catch up with the frontiers of technology, and it's just going to get worse with artificial intelligence because it's moving so quickly that it's very hard to identify what the harms are and therefore how you're going to mitigate them with regulation.
What dangers do you see on AI there? On top of all of this,
Well, the major danger is that it will empower bad people to do bad things. So all the bad things are things that are happening already. Money laundering, attacks on privacy, fraud, cyber attacks, ransomware, all of this stuff becomes much easier with AI. AI also is a way of defending against these kinds of bad actors, and so there's going to be an arms race where you have kind of offensive and defensive AI that are going to be fighting each other, but I think the bad people always have an advantage because they're going to move first, and they've got a big incentive to use the technology, to enrich themselves.
Yeah, because AI it's a challenge on top of all of this. So on the political level, right? So we have this disintermediation of information, which is breeding disinformation. We have the algorithms that breed polarization. And then on top of it, we have AI. Actually, I'm not sure the impact it will have on politics, because all those impacts you mentioned are surely very dangerous, but they are not really in the political realm, like most of them. I mean, money laundering, cyber attacks and whatnot.
Well, I think AI also has a lot of strategic implications. It's a weapon that can be used. It's certainly important in military affairs, and I think one additional reason why it's going to be hard to regulate the internet is that, in the realm of AI, you have this competition with China, where the United States doesn't want to fall behind China and vice versa, and so they're going to be very skeptical about any form of regulation that slows them down.
This may be a naive question, but do you think, given the power of AI, do you think it has any role in solving the first problem we talked about, which is government effectiveness? Do you see it as a tool that can actually make the governments more effective?
No, it's got a million ways that it can help government. There's a lot of kind of clerical work and filing of, forms and this sort of thing where AI is actually going to speed things up tremendously. Just to give you one concrete example, in the United States, we have laws that require a public notice of, government bureaucrats that change rules. And recently, you're getting millions of comments being made by ordinary citizens that can't be processed by human beings in any reasonable amount of time. But the AI can do it. They can take 1 million comments and they can summarize, what are the major concerns that people have and how can we deal with it in a kind of straightforward way. So there's definitely
It's an interesting idea. It's a way to bring people closer to government, in a sense.
And to make it more responsive.
It rhymes a bit with another idea which I wanted to ask you about. In a sense, it's very different, but it has some connection, I think. It has been proposed by many people. It has been tried in some countries, which is I think they are called deliberative assemblies or something like that, which is so the idea is that you know what I'm talking about, right? So just to describe it quickly for the listeners. So the idea is that you bring over sort of a random sample of the population, so of electors, of voters, and you bring them in and they work as a sort of a parliament with the politicians. They understand the difficulties of making political decisions. The politicians understand people's worries and preoccupations. Right. Then in the end, it's a way to maybe solve some of these problems.
Yeah, by the way, the success of that kind of deliberation depends on it not being electronically mediated. I think that, the most successful cases are where people actually have to sit down in a room with each other and talk to each other and actually debate. If you do it over the internet, you lose a lot of that civility that's necessary to keep a real deliberation going.
I haven't read about this in a while. Are there role models here? So are there countries which have been able to...
Yeah, Denmark has used a lot of these things. We have a lab in our institute at Stanford, deliberative democracy lab, and they've done these kinds of what they call deliberative polls all over the world. And, the claim is that they actually work pretty well. You take a random selection of people, you put them in a hotel for 3 days, you give them a lot of information about the problem they're trying to solve, and you make them talk to each other. Mm-hmm. They can't, go out and get on the internet and start complaining and, this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. They have to actually deliberate, and it usually leads to a consensus decision on even very difficult social issues.
Interesting. And do you have other ideas that might work to put the system back in working, so other than these and using AI? So are there any ideas that should have more, we should give more attention to?
Well, I think that basically reminding ourselves of the importance of impersonal government and the ideal that had been around for some time that that public service should be something that's valuable, and that it really should attempt to serve the interests of the whole public and not just the narrow interests of one politician. That's really the crisis we're having in the United States right now, because Donald Trump wants civil servants to be loyal to him, not to the Constitution, not to the general public, but personally loyal. And when that's soldiers that he's demanding this loyalty of, it becomes very dangerous, because he basically wants his own, private militia. And, in a way, that's the kind of America that we're working our way towards.
There's a view I'm very sympathetic to, and you probably as well, which views the bureaucracy as a sort of a fourth power in the separation of powers, right? So ideally, obviously, the role of bureaucracy is to implement policies defined by the government, but it also should be independent should have some autonomy from the government and work as a sort of a check and balance on itself.
Well, you see that in central banks, there's been a big move towards independent central banks over the last couple of generations, and that's done wonders for monetary policy, because you need to take those out of the control of politicians. Politicians will always want lower interest rates, but sometimes lower interest rates will lead to much higher inflation, and that's why you need independent technocrats to be making those kinds of decisions.
Yeah, and now what you're seeing, it's exactly the opposite. And it's I was going to say a fun thing, not fun, but interesting implication is that what is happening in the US is very much one of the main concerns of the founding fathers. So if you go back to the early literature, even George Washington, he was against political parties, right, as you know,
right.
Because he felt that political parties would end up, well, actually, as they are right now. So it worked for a long time, but now it's kind of a fracturing.
Yeah, well, as a political scientist, I don't think you can do without political parties, but certainly they can get, out of touch and ossified and so forth.
Yeah. There's one thing I wanted to ask you before, and then I forgot. There's this political scientist, Yascha Mounk. I'm not sure if it's the right way to pronounce it. He has an interesting thesis, I don't know if you agree with, that the reason we are facing this turmoil is that societies are much more diverse than they were in the past. So this is because of immigration, but not only immigration. In the US, you also have sort of a rebalancing of minorities, people reclaiming their rights and whatnot. And his point, although he's not a pessimist, I think, but his point is that if we look back at functional democracies, they were always culturally homogeneous, at least to a large extent. So that seems to be sort of a prerequisite for democracy to work. Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't think he ever stated it in terms that were that strong.
Maybe I'm not being generous to that.
Yeah, I think that the way I would put it is it's much easier to have a democracy in a small homogeneous country where you don't have a lot of ethnic divisions or racial divisions, big inequalities between different groups in the society. So that's a much less difficult governance problem. When you do have a lot of diversity and heterogeneity, people don't speak the same language, they don't look like each other, you can govern democratically in a society like that, but it's just harder. I think that's really the argument that he was making. And certainly the conclusion from that is not that we should aim to get more homogeneous societies.
No, it's not. I know.
It's really that, we just have to recognize that, governing a big, diverse country like India is very different from, governing a small, pretty homogeneous country like Denmark.
Yeah. And the same thing goes for the European Union. So this is a big barrier to more European integration and build the European Union into something more akin to a state like the United States is cultural, and especially language barriers. So, I don't know, are you, from your standpoint, looking from the other side of the ocean, do you think there's any hope of the European Union? because we actually we should do it if we are to take advantage of the internal market, of the size of the economy.
No, I think that you need stronger centralized institutions in Europe, and in particular, you need to move to some form of qualified majority voting so that every member of the EU does not have a veto over the collective action.
That explains a lot of Orban's power within the EU, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Right, because he has that power to veto whatever is happening. We've been talking about populism, and implicitly we're talking about right-wing populists, but we were having this conversation 15 years ago. We would be talking more about left-wing policy. And one thing I've wondered is, are we going to see a comeback of left-wing populists? Do you think so?
Well, it never disappeared in certain parts of the world, like Latin America.
Yeah, sure, but I mean...
So the Kirchners and AMLO, I mean, these were all left-wing populist politicians, and I don't think that trend has disappeared there. Whether it comes back in Europe or the United States, I think it's completely possible that, there's in fact a kind of convergence between the extreme left and the extreme right in their distrust of existing elites. Mm-hmm. They distrust them for different reasons, but I think that, there's also a ground for, a left-wing kind of populism.
Especially if you think, which is kind of a paradox here. So one of the main trends of the last decades has been, especially in the US, rising inequality. And usually one would think that would give fuel to left-wing populists, right? And yet, that's not what we are seeing.
That's true.
Even in Europe. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. This has been a great conversation.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you just one final question for listeners that have been reading you for decades, since the end of history and The First Man, which is, I think, the first book that brought you to fame, which was published in 1992. Was it? Probably around then.
That's right.
Where would you say your views have changed the most over these last decades?
Well, I really rewrote that book in my 2-volume series on political order, which was based on a much broader understanding of historical development. And then the last 2 books I've written, the one on identity and the other one, liberalism and its discontents, really try to take the events of the last few years and understand them in the framework that I set with the original End of History book. So I guess those are the places I'd look.
Okay, cool. Is there anything else you wanted to say I didn't ask?
I just would like to point out, if you want to keep up with what I think about a lot of current events, I have a blog called Frankly Fukuyama. I've got a YouTube channel with the same name.
You do? Really?
Yeah. So if you want to keep up with what I'm thinking, I would go to those places.
Oh, so a fellow YouTuber, as it were.
Yeah.
Okay. Professor Fukuyama, thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Este episódio foi editado por Hugo Oliveira. Ouça e veja outros podcasts em expresso.pt e veja como seguir o 45 graus em josemariapimentel.pt. Até ao próximo episódio.